Welcome to another edition of Inside Rosenberg and Estes. If you're a contractor, this show is for you. That's right. We're going to help you today think through how you're pricing your next job or what you're going to do to make sure your current job makes money. My guest today is Raychel Camilleri, and she is an attorney here at Rosenberg and Estes, but her focus is on helping you, contractors, work on your contracts so that you make the profit you planned on making, whether your job is impacted by tariffs or not. Now, look, that seems like a heavy lift, but we're going to give you some ideas on what you can do today and into the future to help scope out these projects so that they make the most sense moving forward. Hi, Raychel. How you doing today?
Hey, good morning, Dave. Thanks for bringing the energy. Great introduction.
All right. Well, thank you. I know this is a topic that's important to a lot of people. You know, it's in the news right now. It's hot. And 3 or 4 years from now, this may or may not be relevant, but something else will come along that will impact the price of materials or that will impact the way people who are scoping out jobs, people who are contractors, are writing their contracts. So when you and I met a couple of weeks ago, we had a really interesting conversation about options people have if materials or market conditions are impacting a contract that you've written and scoped out. So we're going to get into that. We're going to dig deep into this, and you're going to give us some thoughts on what people can do. Before we get into that, one of the things that I've experienced over the years is whenever I put an expert in front of people, they want to know who the hell this person is and what qualifies them to talk about this stuff. So tell us a little bit about you. Give us your background. How long have you been practicing law? Why construction? And why are we talking about contractors? Why are you talking about contractors?
Certainly. Thanks, Dave. So I've been practicing law now, going to age myself here, almost 15 years. Been great experience, worked successfully as a trial attorney. And Dave, in addition to my transactional work and the advisory work I've done, I've also tried dozens of cases. Been working, doing construction and kind of this crossover niche of construction and products, representing vendors, and all for the last 6 or 7 years of my practice. Working now a lot with the owners and the developers on those projects, as well as the vendors, the general contractors, construction managers, and contractors and subcontractors throughout my time, the last 7 or 8 years now. Came to Rosenberg and Estes just recently. I got to know you, Dave, and we had this great conversation that you alluded to a couple weeks ago, and we thought this would be a great idea for a podcast to get the information out while the topic is still hot. And frankly, it's been a hot topic for a number of months now. It was brought up back in 2018, and it's kind of just brought it to the next level now.
Okay, so your experience is in looking at contracts and defending them, looking at contracts and helping people kind of fix things that are wrong with them. So you're uniquely suited to be able to help contractors because your entire experience has been in and around either taking apart or patching up contracts, correct?
That's correct. And, I'll be the person, I always say at the end of the day, holding the bag when and if the need arises for a trial. So I've also worked in consulting on contracts and the execution of contracts and negotiating them, because I know what'll happen at the end of the day when we're in court and we're litigating these issues, and God forbid we get before a jury, or if it's a bench trial and we have to make these arguments and what's likely to work and what's not likely to work.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the different clauses that are in a contract in general that people should look at. I find that 2 clauses that people miss all the time, and I'm curious about your opinion on this, is the jurisdiction, so the venue, right? The laws that are applicable and where we're going to fight if we have a fight, right? And the second thing is who's going to pay attorney's fees. So tell people a little bit about those 2 clauses and why they need to look at those first.
Certainly, you always want to know what jurisdiction you're in. Are we litigating? Are we in the court system? Are we in arbitration? We do a lot of AAA construction arbitrations. Sometimes they even call for baseball arbitrations. Or if if you're in the practice that I've been most comfortable in through my career, we're in the court systems. We're usually in New York or federal courts. That's my playground, as I say, and where I'm most at home, presenting in the courts. And it's always important to know the differences because that depends on what evidence is coming out, what laws are controlling. Is it New York laws? Is it federal laws? Are we in another district? Are we in Washington? Are we in Ohio? Different laws per state. New York's always been known as the exception state. So always important to know if you're in New York and doing a project in New York, that you're in the New York legal system.
All right, so we look at those two clauses. What other clauses do you look at in a contract? Like when you first get it, what are the first three things, like 2 or 3 things that you circle?
You know, we're always looking at time. Time is money, as they say. So you always are looking for a time is of the essence clause, or a further defined time. Perhaps it's 18 months, perhaps it's 3 years. That's always a very important clause. We are always dealing with delays. They are inevitable on every project. I don't think I've ever had a project go forward without a delay. We're also looking, is this a GMP or gross max price contract? Is this a cost plus contract? Is this a materials and price contract? Or are we doing some other sort of off-kilter contract here? We're also looking at some problematic clauses that may arise. There are the AIA contracts and documents. Usually we like to modify those as much as possible so that they are per project and per the needs of the project. So at this time, when we're talking about tariffs, as you know, I'm very in favor of price escalation clauses here.
All right, so we got to go back. So let's start with the different types, right? GMP, time and materials. Break down the different types for us, please.
So most owners and lenders, they want a surety. They want to make sure that they are staying in budget and on task. So they want the gross maximum price. They want to know at the end of the day, what is this going to cost me? We're not going above that amount. So that's what the gross max price is. Time and materials, you're paying for the time and you're paying for the materials. That, you know, as delays happen, as materials pricing increases, like we are seeing currently, those contract prices go up and they can get out of control. So there you would want to look for a clause for perhaps termination for convenience of the owners if I'm working with the owners and developers. And then you also have a cost plus in contract. So you're looking at the contractor will get all the costs plus an amount over and above that as their profit margin. But as the costs are rising on a project because of what we're seeing now, that margin for profit continues to dwindle.
Okay, so the GMP contract is the most problematic, in my opinion, right now, right? So your cost plus, if your materials prices go up because of tariffs,
The cost.
everybody gets it, right? So the costs go up, you're paying me cost plus here's what the cost is for the materials. The tariffs have raised the cost. It is what it is. Now, then there's the time and materials you said. So time and materials, again, you're showing them what the costs are. I mean, is it really, with those two particular contracts, there's not a lot of ambiguity there. There's not a lot of gray area there. So the tariffs, everybody sees what the impact of the tariffs are. Am I correct in that?
You're correct, I would say, from a contractor's perspective. So if you're on the side of a lender or you're the owner, you don't want to see costs go out of control. So you're looking for a way to perhaps get out of that contract or cap those costs so that the costs on the project and the budgets aren't being blown. In addition, you're still seeing supply issues and getting the materials and shortages that have been forced here. So you're still seeing problems with those. From a contractor's perspective, the risk is more on the owners and the developers or the lenders in those scenarios. Whereas you're correct, the GMP, the contractors are taking on the risk. So they're most at risk in those contracts.
So when you say they want to get out of the contract, I mean, from the perspective of the developer, if you're going to get out of this contract, you're probably just going to delay the project. I mean, because whoever is going to do the project, unless they had these materials to build whatever, a 75-story building in their backyard, everybody else is going to have the same expenses, right? So if they're going to get out, they're just going to delay the construction on the project for a year, 2 years, however long it takes for the prices to come down. Am I reading too much into that?
There is a cause for concern for that going on. You want to make sure in that contract that you have a termination for convenience clause, and that clause also flows down, because you usually have a controlling contract at the top with the owners or the developers and the general contractors. Then the general contractors will inevitably have hired subs.
Yeah.
So you need to make sure that the owner is not on the hook or at risk from a sub coming after them for their contracts being terminated in those events. So there's significant concerns with just, okay, we're not going to go forward with this project, prices are too high, let's wait. You need to really contact your lawyer, go through those contract terms, make sure you can terminate, make sure you've got flow down provisions in the general contractor's contracts with their subs as well.
All right. So from the developer's perspective, is it standard to put like a buyout in there? So the contract is worth $10 million. If I decide to get out before the 50% mark, I'm going to pay you $75,000 and the contract is over? Or is it just, hey, I'm done, and they walk away? What's the standard?
There really is no clear-cut standard. It is per contract, so we negotiate a lot of times on the owner's behalf. You know, they've got significant bargaining power at the table. They're the ones that are building this project. So we do try to keep a termination for convenience in those contracts. But my biggest concern there would be, again, those flow down contracts. Does the owner, does the developer have control of the contracts that the GC now has with the sub? Some projects they do, some projects they do not. So you want to make sure to go look at the rest of those contracts. Usually in our contracts with the GCs, you will have a provision where the GCs are supposed to provide you with those contracts. So that's what you're going to want to go look to first.
Okay, so this is a great point. So we're talking about three different parties now. We're talking about developer, talking about general contractor, and then subcontractor. And on big jobs, the subcontracts can be as big as some regular general contracts. So if you're a subcontractor, you have a contract with the GC, the general contractor, but you could also be governed by terms under the contract that the developer has with the general contractor. So if you're listening or watching and you're a subcontractor, you want to see the contract with the general contractor, correct?
Correct. And a lot of times you do have those provisions written right into your contract. Just, you want to be careful, again, to speak with your attorney, make sure it's the full contract that you see there.
Okay. All right. So now we didn't touch on, and I want to get into the GMP contract, right? The gross maximum price contract. I mean, look, as a business guy, I would tell anybody in this environment, no GMP contracts. And if the developer says to you, you have to have a GMP contract, and you tell me somebody's going to agree to it, I would say you got to put some type of a clause in there that allows for price increases if you can't get materials, or if the materials become so expensive because of tariffs that it's just going to blow your whole budget. What are you telling people today, Raychel?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And that's where this price escalation clause is so important to negotiate and to be very precise on the terms of this price escalation clause. Even if you're already operating under, say, a GMP contract, and some of these projects take several years to conclude, do you need to go back to the negotiating table? Do you need a rider? Do you need an amendment? Can we get this clause in there? Because look, no developer wants to stop their projects. Time is money, and significant projects, significant time is significant money. So getting this price escalation clause in a way that, allocates the risk and balances the risks so that the contractors can continue to work and that they don't feel the threat of needing to shut down the project or walk away, in which case they could be at significant risk and owe significant money under their contracts.
All right. So let's talk about contracts that are in process or in progress now, right? From a developer's perspective, what's the guidance you're giving developers right now? If contractors are coming to them and they're saying, hey, steel's going to cost 50% more, or anything with copper in it is going to cost 30% more, or the materials we were going to source from China are going to cost 125% more.
Yeah.
So as a developer, what are you counseling the developers to do when contractors are coming to them looking for leeway in these GMP contracts?
I do encourage, again, bringing everyone to the table, having fair negotiations here, because the process you're talking about, usually we see this through change orders. So the owner is getting significant volume right now of heavy reliance on these change orders by the contractors, by the subcontractors for the significant price increases. This will only cause more substantial delays and threats of non-payment, and potentially you would have contractors saying, we've not been paid for the work we've been doing, and they may put a lien on your building and your project. And that's, not a position you want to be in as a developer or an owner.
So basically, you got to go back to the negotiating table, and I mean, transparency is probably the rule of the day here. If the contractor just says, here's what this is cost, here's what I budgeted for, this is an invoice from last year for these materials, here's what it's costing now. Not only can I not make any money on this project, but this will cause me to lose significant money. And there's a real risk that some companies, either subcontractors or maybe even some general contractors, they might be fighting for their lives if these expenses are so severe. And it does nobody any good to have a contractor go out of business in the middle of a job, right?
That's correct. And so a lot of times what you want to do when you're negotiating these price escalation clauses, first you want a clear and precise triggering event. Something like over 5%, because we all can acknowledge and agree that there's going to be a point where the prices are in flux. But anything over, say, 5% or 10% price increase to the materials is going to be substantial, and that's going to trigger this price escalation clause. So that's the very first thing you want. You want that triggering event language in there, and you all want to agree to that language to put in there. Secondly, what you're discussing, we can allocate that. That can be broken up by percentages. The owner is not going to want to take on a significant amount of that price increase. That's not their role. That's not what they're doing. So maybe the owner takes on 30% over that 5 or 10% mark, or whatever that triggering event is, and then 70% of that cost above that goes back to the contractor.
So you and I had a conversation. I brought up a development project that I was part of during 9/11, and there was a force majeure clause, and that was very, very helpful during that time period because terrorism. It was considered covered under that. So. Force majeure, though, you don't think that's a good idea here, right? You don't think that makes a lot of sense?
So I think there's going to be a significant increase in the use of the force majeure. I do agree that we're going to see that here being litigated. However, I don't know that the courts are going to back it. They inherently will find that it has to be a specific triggering event. And I don't think anyone had the foresight to see these tariffs coming. It's not a natural disaster. It's not, we can argue that it's outside the control of the contractor, certainly, but it's not some form of massive disaster that couldn't be controlled. In addition, the only thing that a force majeure clause will get you is extra time. So that's not going to cure the additional costs and the risk allocation of the cost, which is why I'm much more in favor of this price escalation clause.
All right. So, Raychel, let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about something you and I haven't discussed previously, but that's coming to my mind now. So, if you're doing a development now, right, there's two things you need. You need material and you need labor in order to build a building. Well, you got tariffs that may impact the material, and you've got a clampdown on immigration, which could significantly impact the labor. how does the labor aspect play into this? Is it similar to the materials? So let's say, so you've got 150 people that are on your payroll that are doing this job, and then all of a sudden there's a wave, and I live and work in Miami. I've seen this. There's a wave that comes through, and that those 150 people, 60 of them are gone for one reason or another. They're either picked up and sent back, or they're hiding. And you can't find, I'm not even joking with you, you can't find half of your labor force. What about the labor aspect? Let's say labor becomes an issue now. Is labor different than materials, or is it kind of part and parcel of the same thing?
So labor will be different. We can't put that, certainly under a price escalation clause unless we could argue that the labor costs have increased substantially, but that will be very tough. You can't use any sort of precise cost index to estimate that. So that would be a very tough argument. You could potentially look at a change in law clauses. We've had significant changes in the law. You could also use this for the tariffs as well. So you've had changes in immigration law which have affected your labor and your labor shortage, and you're faced with that. Again, I would still be in favor of everyone coming to the table, discussing this, being transparent, and allocating the risk and trying to balance the risk. At the end of the day, I think the subcontractors are going to bear more of the risk for the labor shortage. And what they could do, I would say, is look for time extensions. Speak with counsel. Always go to your counsel first if you're a subcontractor, and then determine the appropriate avenue that you can look to seek an extension, and advise the general contractor, advise the owner of any potential delays in getting this work done if you're facing this significant labor shortage.
So overall, so you put a change in law clause in there. I think the argument is going to be that they're just enforcing laws that are current and on the books that they weren't enforcing in the past. So it's going to be, it's kind of an uphill battle, no?
Yeah, no, it's certainly a tough and an uphill battle. Again, you could be arguing force majeure clauses. I do see the potential for an increased litigation on these issues, and an increased willingness to argue these issues as force majeure. They're certainly not within the control of the contractors or the subcontractors on these jobs. I just get wary because what the courts have inherently found, at least in New York, is that these need to be very clear and specific, and have clear definitions. They also require the notice requirements, and the adjustable timelines are the only, real remedy available to the subcontractors, which again leads me, to say transparency, speak with the owners, speak with the general contractors, speak if there's a construction manager on site or a project manager, speak with them, tell them the problems you're having. I'm sure they're already seeing the change orders, in the face of labor shortages for the overtime. What are you going to do if you don't have the labor? You're just going to make the labor that you do have work longer hours, work weekends. So you're seeing significant change orders probably for the overtime as well.
All right. So if you're the developer, can you put in the contract that you want some assurance that all of their labor is in compliance with currently existing immigration laws? I mean, is that even a thing? Like you certify that you're following all the laws? Like, because here's where I'm coming from. I'm seeing now, we work with in my business, I work with some agriculture companies, and at farms, like orange groves and landscapers are having it's a huge problem. This is the first place and let's be candid, the customs and immigration folks, they have quotas. And the first place they go to meet their quotas of looking for undocumented folks is agricultural communities and farming communities. So, if you think you're coming to work and you're going to get arrested, you're not going to go to work. So there are days when nobody shows up and they can't produce what they're supposed to produce. I would imagine that laborers and these sorts of folks, they're running into similar situations. Contractors are running into similar situations with these folks. So as a developer, how do I protect myself so that if I don't want this to become my problem. We can give an extension of time for you to go find more people, but I don't want to have to pay for your overtime if half of your workforce goes away. So what do I do to protect myself as a developer?
You could probably put in a clause, I know in New York we have a lot of strong labor unions. So if you're getting them through the labor unions, you kind of shift that problem to someone else's problem. The labor force is coming from the unions, and they, have certain requirements in order to be union laborers. So I would certainly suggest that clause if that's, looking at what you're looking to do.
Okay. So let's recap what we've discussed today. First and foremost, there are some general clauses, good times, bad times, you need to look at to make sure that your contracts are in alignment, right? Venue provision, legal fees, and whether you're going to court or arbitration. And if it is arbitration, talk to your lawyer, because there are some types of arbitration that are better for your side than the other side. So always make sure your lawyer looks at that. Second is venue. Make sure you're going to be fighting in a venue that is close to you and that your lawyer says is the best venue for you to be going into court with. Then there's the three types of contracts we talked about, two of which you can probably pass along some of the costs. The third, the gross maximum, what's the term? The gross maximum?
Gross maximum price.
Gross maximum price. You're going to need to come to the table and you're going to have to work it out. And when you're coming to the table to work it out, it's in everybody's best interest to come to some sort of an agreement. Nobody benefits from things not happening, and extensions of time are going to kill the project. So you want to try and work it out. And then when it comes to labor, you also want to make sure that you're protected in there. And you've talked about price escalation clauses. Raychel, give us some of the terms that need to be included in a price escalation clause from a developer perspective.
So from a developer perspective, you're going to want to look at that triggering event that we spoke about. What specific amount over, above, you don't want to be on the hook for these small increases in price. That's not fair to any sort of developer or owner. Certainly that risk, if you ask me, should be borne by the general contractor. They're looking to profit off this job. So you want that triggering event to be an amount over and above what should be normally occurring in our market. Then you also want to look at what the most effective or price escalation clause should be tied to the most reliable and accepted index. We've certainly suggested the producer price index, which is published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. You want it to be a reliable source. You don't want it to be some other number out there floating around that anyone could interpret as not being applicable here. And then you may want to also look at, there's other items. You could look at comparing the contractor's purchase orders at the time from the beginning of the project to the current purchase orders later in the project. The problem we have here is that it's a little bit harder to enforce, and it's varied interpretations and manipulations by the parties. So some courts have some difficulty accurately capturing local economic trends, in which case in the litigation realm, that's when we call in the experts, the significant increase now to the cost of litigating this project. So that's where I would be looking first and foremost. And then we talked about, the way to document the mechanism through the percentages. The owner would pay, for instance, 30%, and the contractor would pay 70% the increased costs for the materials.
All right. So do you foresee a shift in contracts away from GMP to time and materials or to cost plus contracts during this period of uncertainty with tariffs and that sort of thing? Do you think that's where we're going to be heading?
There's certainly support for that. The Associated General Contractors of America has recommended the cost plus agreements, considering the tariffs and the uncertainty we're now facing. However, I do still think this will be a harder sell to owners and developers who generally prefer the GMP. They're working with lenders, so they have pressure from lenders as well for the cost certainty on the projects and budgets. We thought we might have seen this with the first Trump era and the tariffs that occurred back in 2018, but we didn't see so much of a shift away from the GMP as we expected. In addition, we dealt with COVID, we dealt with significant delays there and cost, supply shortages. We can all remember the supply chain issues we all learned about at that point. So the costs were increased there, and we really didn't see the shift away from it. I think the Associated General Contractors of America are still calling for these cost plus agreements, but this is something, again, they've been calling for the last 7 or so years. So I don't know. I think, the bargaining power is still in favor of the owners and developers who ultimately will be, having more power at the table since it's their projects going forward.
All right, Raychel, where can people get a hold of you if they want you to take a look at their contracts, or if they're in the middle of a contract and they need some help with it? How can people get a hold of you? What's the best way?
Sure. Email's always available. So Raychel Camilleri, working at Rosenberg and Estes. So it's R Camilleri, CAMILLERI at rosenbergestes.com. And then my phone number, which is always available, is 212-551-1219. Again, it's 212-551-1219.
Okay, we're going to put all of that down in the show notes, and I'm sure they put the phone number up on the screen while we're talking here. Raychel, thank you so much for joining us today. It was an absolute pleasure having you, and this is a topic I'm sure we're going to revisit at least a couple of more times in the next few years. So stay tuned, folks, and thanks for joining us here today on Inside Rosenberg and Estes.
Great. Thanks for having me, Dave.